Okay, so welcome everyone to my talk about how your browser is snitching on you and how you can take control. So first off, before we start, I want to try something new today. So here you can see I have a Menti set up. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to either scan the QR code now here and then simply write your questions once they come up. Or you can always just also enter menti.com into your browser and then use the code that you see on the top. And don't worry, you don't need to hurry. You will see the code on the other slides as well. So then you can always also use that to log in and ask questions if you have one. Or you can also ask questions at the end if you like. You can also ask them, with voice. The moderators will unmute you at the end. Let's see how many there will be. And also, let me take a moment to thank all of the organizers and helpers and sponsors of the JCON, and thanks for making it possible. That's really nice. So then let me first quickly introduce myself. So my name is François Martin, as you've heard before. I'm a senior full-stack software engineer at Karakun, which does mainly consulting services, but also has some semi-furnished products. And then on the left, you can see all of the ways you can contact me. And I'm also an active member of the Swiss Testing Board. And please also remember at the end of the presentation to give your feedback. I really like feedback to be able to improve. You can do this on the session planner of shed.com from JCON. So first, before we take a look at what data our browsers reveal about us that we might not be aware of, let's first maybe discuss why websites even have an interest in the first place in our data. So normal users, they usually assume that they cannot be identified uniquely on the internet without having a login or an account. And this kind of conflicts with the fact that advertising agencies and websites want to be able to uniquely identify users at any point. The reason of that is because on the one hand, agencies want to be able to place targeted ads. And this increases the relevance of the ads, which means that the likelihood of people clicking on the ads increases. And with that, also the revenue of the ad agencies, of course. And websites want to tailor their offerings and recommendations to the user. For example, online shops analyze what kind of products we add to our cart or that we view, and they make recommendations based on that for similar products or maybe for complementary purchases. And this, in the end, increases sales. And you may know sites like this, like Amazon, that do those things, which are kind of, known, I would say. And all of this identifiable collected data that, together forms a detailed behavior profile of your online activity. And this includes, from political affiliation to education level and to the income bracket. So how do websites identify us? There are mainly two ways here. So on the one hand, there are tracking cookies, which probably most of you know, I would guess. So upon the first visit that you make, the website saves a cookie that is associated with the website you are visiting in your browser. And then every time you visit the website again, the cookie will be read by the website, and by the cookie that is stored, it knows who you are because it still has kind of a reference to you. And all of the activity that you do on the website is associated with this cookie and also saved. And you can think of this as if you think of an analogy. Let's say you have a conference in real life, not like JCON World is online, where you have lanyards. Of course, I mean in online conferences you don't have them, but in conferences usually it's kind of typical to wear lanyards. And they usually have a sequential number on it, for example, or a name or whatever. But let's assume in this example that you would just have a sequential number on it. The thing is, the booths can, exchange information with each other because they recognize your number, and maybe you talk to them at the booths, and they, you exchange some information. And, then they know that you told them something, and they know that they can associate this with the number that you have on your lanyard. And the booths can then exchange this information to other booths and then talk to each other. And then together they can complete the image, so to speak. So, maybe you talk at one booth about, one thing, for example, where you work at, and then at a different booth, you talk to them, maybe where you live. And then two booths can talk to each other, and then they have both the same picture because they reference you by your number, and they know that this number has these kinds of details associated to them. And the visitor can refuse to wear a lanyard or can stop wearing it at some point. Refusing to wear a lanyard is the same as when you're blocking tracking cookies, which you can do. Or if you stop wearing it at some point is maybe if you delete your cookies, which you can also do. Or if you do both, of course, deleting and blocking them afterwards. And then there is also fingerprinting, which is probably less known, I would say. So users are usually recognized in fingerprinting based on the data that the browser transmits either by itself or is asked to transmit. Some data is always transmitted by the browser, even if we don't explicitly request it by the server. But there is a wealth of information that the browser can read from the system without even asking the user for permission first, which it then happily just transmits to the server that asks for it. And also here to make an analogy to the lanyards. So even if you don't wear a lanyard, a visitor can be somewhat identified uniquely based on, for example, their hair color, language, accent, and so on. And then, they can also this way, by finding unique attributes or combinations of unique attributes, they can also identify you, and then they can still talk to other booths, and then they can simply say like, this person, for example, this woman that had red curled hair with a French accent, if that's something that is unique, at this point, then this could be one way that they could still talk to each other, and then still this way complete an image about a person that they don't even know the name maybe of. So now to understand how, the browser sends data to the websites, let's have a look at how the browser communicates with websites. So probably most of you know this already. There is a server which hosts a website, for example, and this is usually, like the cloud. It's just another computer in a data center, which runs a web server and makes the content available on the internet. There's a request that gets made, the server responds, and then this is shown by the browser, what the response is. And in this talk, we have both request and response, metadata in the headers and the content in the body. And in this talk, we are mostly concerned with the data that is either in the headers or that is read by JavaScript and then simply sent explicitly to the website itself. So now the question is, what kind of data can the browser reveal about us without asking for our explicit permissions, and why? Maybe can and should we prevent that? So let's have a look. This is only an excerpt, by the way, so there is even more data than what you see here. But you see there is quite a lot. So actually, even if you might not think this at first, there is actually a reason why they are transmitted in the first place. So you can see, for example, the browser is transmitted because, for example, depending on the browser and the version, maybe you want to make some differences. Maybe, there are certain features that are supported by certain browsers, but by other browsers they are not. And then you want to maybe warn the user that visits the website that the experience may not be as good, or you want to change some things to use features that are supported by browsers, and so on. Or, for example, it could also be that depending on the operating system, you have some other things you want to show. For example, if you download a file somewhere, you probably have noticed that usually it automatically chooses the right operating system, and it does this by reading this information, which also makes it, of course, more convenient. But they can also see the installed plugins or extensions, the screen resolution, the installed fonts, which, especially if you're like me and you have, maybe a special kind of font that you use, this is also transmitted. And then you also get the processor architecture, which could also be useful to know how much, what kind of processor you're dealing with, and maybe to know what kind of download you need to provide, and even more data that you can see here. There's also a technique which is called canvas fingerprinting, with which you can get information, about differences between video card hardware and drivers. And this also is quite unique to some degree. And the WebGL render and parameters, which are also quite different depending on the system that you have. And of course, the time zone, that is also, depending on where you live, different, of course. And this is something that they can take a look at. And then, of course, are cookies allowed or not? The language, is a touchscreen supported? Is an ad blocker active? And then also the IP address, of course, with which you can get a rough geolocation from it. And, all of this information, for example, if a touchscreen support is there, you can use this to, for example, provide a different UI that allows you to use a touchscreen better, for example, or the hardware, makes sense in terms of what kind of compatibility you have. But there are also other things like a gyroscope, for example, which is probably what you know as, on the one hand, like if your phone is lying down, or is it face down, or is it face up? Is a proximity sensor present that says like how close is your face, for example, to the smartphone, and then also the battery. So here, this interestingly says is a battery present or not? Is it charging or not? Even what is the battery level? Which is kind of crazy to me that this is transmitted, or available through an API. And also how long until the battery is full, or how long until the battery is discharged. I could imagine probably this was thought as a feature if you want to, for some reason, on a website, use this data to display it. I don't know why you would need that, but that's another topic. And interestingly, also the accelerometer. Your smartphone uses this mostly, for example, to know if your phone is, vertical or horizontal, to show the right orientation. Interestingly, this has, this can be used, for example, let's say Google could use this to, if they look at the vibration that are caused, for example, if you're riding in a train, and they compare those vibration patterns to vibration patterns of other people that are also on the train, and they can kind of see which people are on the same train, for example, which is also kind of crazy that you can do this. But, this is all data that you can use. I mean, probably the accelerometer's purpose was that also you can better, estimate what kind of, orientation to show, or maybe, to enable like web apps, like, a level that you could implement this way. So maybe you see fingerprinting is kind of simple, but it's also very effective. So website in fingerprinting simply stores all of the information that is sent by the browser on the one hand, but also that is collected and explicitly sent to the server as kind of the fingerprint of your browser. And then once you visit the website again, the website can then recognize this fingerprint by comparing it to existing fingerprints it has. And this way they can kind of recognize you. And of course, they need to probably do some, rough matching, because maybe your resolution is not always the same, because maybe, you're using a different screen at some point. This is, let's say, the tricky part about it. But the crazy thing about this is that the information is in almost all cases a unique combination. So a website that offers a service for this, which is called fingerprint.com, they claim to have an accuracy of 99.5%. I mean, I have no way of verifying this, but I kind of could believe that it's, maybe close to this, which is, crazy. And even, this is just, by the fingerprint itself, even if you have tracking cookies blocked in this case. So, if you look at the information that is sent that you've seen before, kind of it's not really a surprise that you are able to achieve such an accuracy, because the likelihood of the data being different enough from person to person is quite high, actually. And what this enables websites to do is to uniquely identify users, even if they are not logged in. And, people have different languages, for example, that maybe are even slightly different, like maybe someone has, English from the US or English from Australia or from United Kingdom. Different screen resolutions, time zones, browser versions, installed plugins, and so on and so forth. And if you look at, for example, if you just have the language DE-DE, this is only used in Germany. So if you see a visitor that has this kind of language set, then you know that most likely this person is from Germany. And this already limits the users that are visiting the website quite a lot. Of course, if your website is, in German, then maybe, this doesn't limit it by that much. But if it's a website that is mostly English, probably, you will be able to identify those users much easier than other users, for example. So the principle behind this is kind of, for example, a lot of people, they use Windows, for example, or a lot of people use a resolution that is 1920 by 1080, or maybe a lot of people have a certain graphics card, but only very few people use this very exact combination, for example, and this, makes fingerprinting possible because you can use this combination to uniquely identify people that is, not occurring that many times. So how do we test for fingerprinting to see, how well is it possible in your case, for example? So the most commonly used test that at least I could find is, cover your tracks. It was earlier called panopticlick. Maybe, in case some of you know it from the older name. It is provided by the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a non-profit defending digital privacy, free speech, and innovation. And, they provide this test for free and open source, which is really good in my opinion. And they kind of show you, if you run this test, how unique the fingerprint of your browser is. And it compares that to the data of the users that did the test in the last 45 days. And there are, roughly 4,000 tests per day. This isn't a huge sample size, but, it is still enough to be meaningful, I would say. And especially since the last 45 days are considered, this is quite a lot of data, I would say. There are some other tests, like you can see here. Am I unique is kind of interesting because here you can choose the time range that you want to compare against. But they have less tests compared to cover your tracks, so around 1,000 per day last time I checked. And so to make it a bit interesting, let's look at, an example of a few of my browsers on my system when I run them against this test. Of course, just note this is limited to my system. As you can imagine, just if you use a different screen, it is already different. Or, if I resize the window by a little bit, then it's also different and so on. So let's look at Chrome first. So you can see it already tells you, I have an extension installed to block, ads and tracking cookies and so on. And you can see it tells me my browser has a unique fingerprint. And, so you can see, even though Chrome ramped up kind of their efforts in the recent, times to improve the fingerprinting protection mechanisms, they don't seem to be that effective, at least not on my system. And then let's look at Firefox, which unfortunately is the same here. So Firefox has been even more promoting that they are doing, things against, protection measures against fingerprinting. But also in this case, they don't seem to be that effective, unfortunately. And then let's look at Safari. So interestingly, Safari is a little bit better. You see it says your browser has a nearly unique fingerprint. So, and you can see it's, only 1 in 30,000 browsers has the same fingerprint as mine, which means, if you are visiting a website that has, not a lot of users or not a lot of visitors, then probably it's still possible to recognize you uniquely. If you have, let's say, statistically more than, 30,000 users, let's say 60,000, then it becomes a bit more difficult because you could have 2 people statistically that are, let's say, the same in terms of the fingerprint. So it's better than Chrome and Firefox, but not, let's say, much better, I would say. So probably this is because Safari is used by a lot of people that use Macs, and less plugins are installed usually in Safari, I would say. And this makes it less unique in a way. Also, Safari has implemented quite a few fingerprinting protection measures. I don't know if they are, it could be that potentially they are a bit better implemented than in Safari or Firefox. As it is closed source, I cannot verify this by myself. Still, it's still possible with, let's say, small websites or, let's say, small to medium to still recognize yourself. And then let's look at Brave, which is kind of a more new browser. And here you can see the fingerprint is randomized, which is an advanced kind of fingerprinting protection that Brave has implemented. They randomize certain parts of the fingerprint. Kind of, if you want to think about the analogy again that we had before, you could also, simply not wear a lanyard at the conference. And then to prevent being recognized through fingerprinting, let's say during the day you changed maybe the frame of your glasses, or you changed the arm of the watch you're wearing, or you put on a wig, you put on a fake accent, or something like that, for example. The disadvantage is that on the one hand, as you can see here, of course, you can kind of recognize that the randomization is happening on the one hand, which on the other hand makes you more unique because it kind of tells that you're using Brave and you are using a randomized fingerprint in this case. Also, the fingerprint is only randomized when you close the browser completely and then reopen it again. So you need to remember to do this, regularly to be able to profit from that. And also the thing is, in some instances, it is possible to, it was already possible to revert this randomization, and then you could, get back what was previously randomized. And also this could lead to issues. So by default, the way it is defined is kind of conservative. So by default, it tries to only randomize things that are not very crucial to most websites, but you can set it to be even more strict, but that didn't, change much in terms of the result, at least here. If you set it to be more strict, of course, you could run into issues like, for example, if it randomizes your language, it could be that once you visit a website, maybe you're visiting Google, it shows up in, let's say, Hebrew or something like that, and you may have some trouble understanding it or changing back to your language, for example. And so I did some more tests with Brave just to see how far I could push it or how useful this really is. As here we don't really see how much this means that we can do something with that. So interestingly, I noticed that even, that Brave has a randomized fingerprint. I tried using fingerprint.com on multiple, instances of Brave. I restarted it multiple times, for example. And fingerprint.com has kind of like a live demo that you can look at, which shows you a visitor ID. And then every time, for example, if you restart your browser, you can see, do you still have the same visitor ID or not? And I tried a lot of different things. I tried restarting the browser. I tried changing settings so to make the fingerprinting protections more strong, or just in general the security settings, make it more strict. I deleted the site data, tried the incognito mode. I still had the same ID. So it seems like at least fingerprint.com is still able to recognize you, even though Brave does randomization. The only thing that helped, interestingly, even though this usually should not help, is changing to a VPN. Interestingly, when I changed to the VPN, I got a new ID, but afterwards, when I changed between different servers or different locations from a VPN, it still stayed the same visitor ID. So, I don't know exactly. Probably they know the IP ranges of one one VPN provider, and this is how they can recognize this. But usually changing the IP address shouldn't make a change in the fingerprint, because usually you can still get recognized by all of the other attributes. Like, for example, if they collect a fingerprint of the current data that you have in your browser, and then you simply add the VPN and you refresh the website, everything else is the same. Only thing that has changed is your IP address, and then you could, in theory, recognize that this person is the same, even though that they are using a VPN now. So kind of you see maybe there's kind of a dilemma. So it seems like the more we are trying to protect us against tracking, specifically fingerprinting in this case, the less protection we kind of have against tracking, because, for example, like the randomization, if you add it, it makes it, worse, because you can recognize that, it is randomized. So by installing a plugin, for example, also that with which you block tracking, the browser becomes more unique this way. This does protect you from tracking cookies, but of course this makes fingerprinting more effective at that point. Fingerprinting protections from browsers like Brave, they only offer a limited protection at best, as you have seen earlier. There are plugins like NoScript that prevent the execution of JavaScript, which makes fingerprinting almost impossible, but at the same time also renders almost all websites unusable. So it is not really suitable for everyday use. And the only real protection I could find against tracking cookies and fingerprinting is to use the Tor browser. So the goal of the Tor browser is kind of here to make all of the users seem as similar as possible. So for example, every time you start the Tor browser, the same window size is set for all of the users. And also a lot of the features are limited so that the metadata is more, indistinguishable between different users. And, maybe one disadvantage of the Tor browser is also that sometimes, depending on, when you use it and how lucky you get, based just on the principle how it works, it is kind of slow. So let's look at how the Tor browser fares. So you can see by default, if I just start the browser and I run the test, you can see we have partial protection. So you see it's 1 in 6,600 around. I also ran this test, about 1 year ago, and there the result was a little bit better. So maybe, I just got unlucky or whatever. But still 1 in, let's say, around 6,500 is still quite random, I would say. I mean, sure, it could be even better, but, still I would say it's a lot better than what you have seen before already. And now the interesting thing is, if we just maximize the window, you can see that already the browser has a nearly unique fingerprint. So you can see there are, 1 in 90,000 browsers that have the same fingerprint as yours, which is even worse actually here than, or is, it's 13 and a half times less unique than the result, as when you just leave the browser size that it was by default. Kind of here to make an analogy between the Tor browser and the conference again, it would be as if you would talk to maybe, let's say, 10 colleagues that also go to the conference, and you convince them to not wear a lanyard as well. And then maybe you can make everyone wear the same clothes, wear the same wig, wear the same, maybe, wear shoe inserts so that all of them are sized equally. And this way it becomes impossible to tell who is who, because all of the people look, at least 10 people or how many you talk to, look the same. And so, the Tor browser, unfortunately, is not, really suitable for daily use, especially, as I mentioned, as some features are restricted. Also, some websites are not working properly, and also due to the speed, of course. And now if we set the security to safest, which actually blocks JavaScript, so it kind of behaves in a similar way than NoScript behaves, you can see that this really protects from fingerprinting. So only 1 in 60 browsers. It is still possible, since the browser by default sends some data that you, at least cannot turn off. And then, it's much less, likely that you get recognized. But also, as I said earlier, you cannot really use the web, the web this way, at least with most websites. So, it seems like there's not really a way of protecting yourself without severe disadvantages. So maybe you're asking yourself, what should I do now? So the first option is you have a browser like Chrome, Firefox, Edge, or Opera. And you can install, for example, the Privacy Badger plugin from the EFF, which blocks tracking cookies. And then option 2 would be to use the Brave browsers. Both protect against tracking cookies. Brave protects maybe a little bit better against fingerprinting, but this only applies if you restart your browser frequently. Otherwise, the two options are kind of equivalent. But still, the thing is, protection against tracking cookies is still more important than protection against fingerprinting. If you think about it, if you are a visitor at a conference that are wearing a lanyard, it's still easier to identify you by the number or whatever is written on it than it is to identify a person that is not wearing a lanyard, for example. And if you have a privacy critical case, then try using the Tor browser in this case. And also to note, if you have a website, especially in the EU, that is following the GDPR, they are not allowed to use tracking cookies or perform fingerprinting without you giving explicit consent to it. So if they ask you, for example, in a pop-up, if you want the maximum amount of privacy, then decline as much as possible, of course, and then they are not allowed to use them. I mean, in theory, nothing prevents them to still do that, but you could, there are quite heavy fines with GDPR, so I think most of them probably won't do that. And on the other side, maybe some of you know this as well, tracking is not always bad. It can, really help also developers to make a website better by seeing, in which ways users use the website that is maybe not as efficient. So it's not all bad about it. So now that we looked at what you can do, let's see, maybe what should browsers do to improve this for the future. And you can, I think the browsers should implement more strict default permissions and ask for permissions in more cases. Like, for example, I don't see why the accelerometer data, should be something that you grant automatically from the start. And now you could, of course, make the argument that, you can, for example, at least in some browsers, you can change the settings of your browser to automatically deny the permission for the accelerometer. You can see here, this is, the permissions that you can read out from, for example, Chrome here in this case, that are set by default. But of course, the problem is, as soon as you change something here, like I changed the accelerometer to being blocked or being prompt in this case, as the websites can read what permissions you are exposing, this kind of makes you, more unique again and makes fingerprinting easier. So, especially in this case, that considering that not a lot of websites are using the accelerometer, for, let's say, fingerprinting purposes, probably it is still better to just leave it at the defaults, because probably you're less likely to be recognized for your fingerprint in this case. But if, of course, browsers change this default behavior to be prompt in the first place, then this would be more secure in the first place. there are just some things I cannot understand why they should be automatically granted, since they are not something that you use on the daily, I would say. Now, here you can see the different versions of browsers that are used to do those tests, in case you maybe want to try to replicate them on your own and compare against them. Of course, they are not really that comparable because, of course, you have different, different system than I have. And also, if you're interested in more about this topic, then you can read, up on those following links that you see here. And by the way, I don't know if you have noticed, but on the top right in the corner, you can see a link, a QR code, and this leads you to the slides. And you can also see it again here. I will also post it on the session planner, so you can then download it from there if you haven't got the chance to do this yet. But now it's time to ask questions. So let's see, do we have any? So we have one question. So let's have a look at that. So, can a cookie set on one site used on another site with a different domain? So this kind of depends in a way. I would say, for example, if you have a different subdomain on the same domain, then depending on how you set the settings, of the strictness of cookies, you could use that. But from completely different domains, in most of the cases, this is not allowed by the browsers. There is, let's say, one case, however, for example, if you have a website that includes, for example, a like button from a website, from, let's say, Facebook or something like that. If you load content from Facebook, they could have their own cookie that they use to track you in this way, for example. But, it's not possible that, for example, if you visit google.com and then you go to facebook.com, and you can read the cookie of google.com from facebook.com. This would be a very big security risk. But thanks for the question. It's a really good question, I think. And then let's look at the next one. Any upcoming changes in EU law to protect users further? At least I haven't heard about it. I would say the GDPR is quite strict in the first place. So just in my personal opinion, I think it is much more important for other, let's say, continents or, countries in general to implement more strict law to protect users further in a way, because I think GDPR may be already strict enough, I would say. I mean, of course, it could always be more strict. For example, they could try to get browsers, for example, to, change some settings by default. They also were able to, for example, restrict Apple from using the USB-C port only. So I think this should also be a possibility. Maybe we will see this at some point, at least. I've not heard of plans of this yet. So will the cookie banner go away or automatically decline? So yeah, this is also something I have been annoyed about. I'm not sure, actually. I hope there will be a better solution, let's say, for this. I mean, there is already, for example, a way that in the browser you can change if you want to be tracked or not. Mostly this is something that doesn't really, make sense, or at least it's not really respected. Most of the websites, they simply ignore it. But I think this could be one option, for example, that you could implement a browser feature where you can simply change your default, let's say, cookie behavior on websites, and this would be sent to the websites and they would simply respect this in all cases. But I'm not sure if websites will do this, because most likely they still want to show it because they want to get some people to accept it anyways. Just because they make more revenue this way, of course. Of course, they are able to improve the user experience. There are multiple different aspects that you can look at here. But there are actually some plugins that you can use that on some of the cookie banners, automatically perform actions like declining them and so on. So you can just look for that, which can make it a little bit more convenient. But unfortunately, of course, it doesn't support all of the cookie banners that are available. But also a great question. Thanks a lot. So maybe, I don't know, if someone in the chat has a question that they want to ask, let's say verbally, you can also raise your hand and then one of the moderators can unmute you. Let's give the people a little bit of time. So as I guess, I don't see anyone or hear anyone. And if there's also no new question. So in this case, thanks a lot to everyone that participated, and thanks a lot also for the great questions. Please remember to give a feedback to the session. And also I would be glad if you could not only give like there's a smiley that you can give on the one hand, but also I'm glad for any text comments, because that makes it much easier to understand what I could improve on. I'm really grateful for that. And thanks to everyone for participating, and I wish you a great JCON. For the rest, let's see, thanks a lot.